Us off today is former U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder. So I wanted to start. You've written your fair share of indictments. You've certainly read many of them. What in particular stood out to you when you read this one?
Well, it is what we call a speaking indictment, and the breadth and detail of the indictment, I think, is extremely striking. One looks at the indictment and you see what I think can only be described as an extremely strong case. The detail that is contained in there, the specification of all the actions that the former president actually took. What also strikes me is the fact that his attorneys are clearly going to be witnesses in this case. You know, most of these cases, and I've seen a lot of these kinds of indictments, most of these cases end up in pleas because the ability of the government to prove the case is pretty apparent. It is very apparent here that the government is going to be able to prove this case. This is a strong case. This is an extremely strong case that will, I guess, go to trial. And, you know, you don't want to predict anything, but it's hard for me to see how the defendants in this case, will not be convicted.
So Donald Trump was back on the campaign trail yesterday. He said he would stay in the race for president even if he's convicted in this case. I know there's not a lot of precedent here, but when you consider that possibility, what concerns you the most?
Well, the notion that you could have a trial, defendant be convicted, somehow win the election, be sworn in as president, or whenever it happens, that seems inconsistent with our notion of fairness, of the rule of law. At that point, I would hope that an impeachment proceeding might be considered, not only considered, brought, and ultimately he would be removed from office. The notion that a convicted felon would serve as president of the United States is absurd. It is simply absurd.
So if he is convicted, he's still running. You think there should be an impeachment hearing, impeachment proceedings in Congress, and that could be a step they could take there?
Yeah, I mean, that's assuming that he's convicted, and that's assuming that he wins the election. I think that people have underestimated the impact of this indictment, the one in Manhattan, the two others that I expect, one in Georgia, the January 6th one that I suspect will likely be placed in Washington, D.C. Now, I'm not a political pundit, but I think at some point you certainly won't get beyond, you know, the Trump cult base. But for people who are on the fringes of that, on the outside of that, are likely to be negatively impacted by all of these cases brought against the former president. And I think that that'll have some electoral effect. And so the likelihood that he'll be able to survive this and win a general election, I think is pretty small.
Now, former Attorney General Bill Barr was on Fox News this morning talking about this indictment. Let's take a quick listen to that.
I think the counts under the Espionage Act, that he willfully retained those documents, are solid counts. Now, I do think we have to wait and see what the defense says and what proves to be true. But I do think that even half what Andy McCarthy said, which is if even half of it is true, then he's toast. I mean, it's a very detailed indictment, and it's very, very damning.
I'm sure you don't find yourself agreeing with Bill Barr all that often, I would guess, but what's your reaction to those comments he made this morning? What significance does that have?
Well, you're right. I don't agree very often with Bill Barr or Andrew McCarthy, but I think they both have it right. The case is a strong one. If even half, as Andrew McCarthy says, even half of what is alleged in the indictment are ultimately accepted by a jury, this case, he will be convicted. This is a pretty straightforward case. You have examples of the former president lying to his lawyers, moving boxes so that the lawyers can't access the materials that the grand jury requested. You have one part of it that really struck me. One of the lawyers says that the former president made a plucking motion, as if to say, you know, take out the bad documents so that we don't have to turn those over. I mean, people really do need to read this indictment. It is something that lays out in really graphic detail what it is that the government has charged, and I think ultimately what the government is going to be able to prove. And again, with the assistance of the lawyers that the former president employed at the time.
The New York Times is reporting this morning that Trump-appointed Judge Aileen Cannon was selected at random in this case, which is, of course, how it works in many districts, and will oversee it unless she recuses herself. How concerned are you about that? And should she recuse herself?
Well, from the perspective of the government and from my perspective as a citizen, I'm concerned about her handling this case. Based on what she did in the earlier phases of this matter, I'm not sure that she has the legal acumen to be a judge in charge of such an important case. I certainly don't think that she has the ability, based on what happened before and the way in which she was excoriated by the circuit court for trying to interfere with the FBI's search of Mar-a-Lago. I don't think she has the ability to project the notion of neutrality that a judge who's handling this matter has got to be able to do. So I would hope that she would see within herself, or that somehow, some way, she is convinced that she should get off the case and that some other judge should handle this matter. I don't have confidence in her abilities to be fair or to be seen as fair.
If she doesn't recuse herself, is there a role, because up to her, that the Department of Justice can take? Do they have any power in this case to change the judge?
Well, it's hard to recuse a judge, and she ultimately makes the first determination about whether or not she should be recused. I suppose there could be an appeal to the circuit court, but for the circuit court to say that we're going to take her off the case would be pretty extraordinary. But you have to understand, people need to understand the power that she will have as the presiding judge. And the thing that gives me the most concern is the ability that she would have to delay this proceeding, both with regard to the amount of time that she gives both sides to file pretrial motions, the ability that she would have to rule on objections during the course of the trial, the way in which she would conduct the voir dire. There's a whole range of ways in which she can have a really negative impact on the case. But the one that concerns me the most is the notion of delay and pushing this case past the general election, certainly well into the primary season, just by the way in which she schedules things. And the fact that I even say that, I would not say this about some judge I didn't know. I'm saying this about a judge who has demonstrated, I think, an ability to lean towards the former president, to favor him. She did extraordinary things that the circuit court said were inappropriate for a trial judge to do when it came to the search of the former president's residence at Mar-a-Lago.
I know you're also celebrating a huge victory before the Supreme Court this week, which ruled on Thursday that the gerrymandered congressional districts in Alabama discriminated against black voters. As we're looking ahead to additional states, Louisiana, Georgia, and Texas, do you think there could be action that would help address those issues there before the next election cycle?
Yeah, Thursday was a big day. There was the indictment, but there also was the ruling from the United States Supreme Court that essentially said that Alabama had put in place a racial gerrymander that diluted the ability of black citizens in that state to fully express themselves. The rationale of that case will have an impact in Georgia, in Texas, in Florida, in other states as well. The Cook report has already said that as a result of that decision, there are at least five, and probably more, at least 5 districts that go from solidly Republican, leaning Republican, to either neutral or now leaning Democrat. So that decision by the Supreme Court will have an impact on the composition of the House of Representatives in 2024, but also demonstrates that as a result of these racial gerrymanders that were put in place earlier, that Republicans got seats to which they were not entitled and probably got control of the House of Representatives as a result of these racial gerrymanders. It was a good decision by the Supreme Court that will have an impact far beyond the borders of Alabama.